Okay, welcome back to demand and supply. We are now going to look at what happens if demand or supply, one of those curves, changes within the context of our market. Right, we've looked at a demand shift on its own. We know increase demand shifts to the right, a decrease demand shifts to the left. But we want to see how does that affect our market equilibrium. So a couple steps recommended here. Some event happens. Decide whether the event shifts the supply curve, the demand curve, or both. Then decide which direction the demand curve shifts or supply curve shifts, right? Which direction do these curves shift, or the curve. Use then your simple diagram, draw in the new demand curve or the new supply curve, see how does this change price and quantity. So the market for hybrid cars. First thing, once again, broken record time. Quantity goes on the x-axis, price goes on the y-axis, right? Always, always, always. We have an initial demand and supply curve for hybrid cars. What does that give us? That gives us our initial equilibrium. We know what the price would be in the market. We know what the quantity would be in the market based on the demand and the supply. So what happens if we have a shift in demand? Okay, effect to be analyzed, increase in the price of gas. How would that affect the demand for hybrid cars? Why don't you pause this for a moment, try to figure out how would that affect the demand, and then how would that change, how would you have to redraw in your demand curve on this graph? Okay. So I hope you thought about this on your own. So an increase in the price of gas. Gas is more expensive. Would that make a hybrid car more or less appealing? Well, hybrid cars use less gas than almost every other car, right? So a hybrid car should be more appealing. So the demand curve was going to shift. The supply curve, we wouldn't expect that to shift, right? Is there any reason the increase in the price of gas should affect how many hybrid cars producers want to make at any given price? No, not in this case. So the demand curve shifts. How does it shift here? We would expect the demand curve to increase, right? Hybrid cars will become more appealing because they'll be, relatively cheaper to operate than conventional cars. The price of gas goes up. You still have to put some gas in hybrid cars, but a lot less than other cars. It makes hybrid cars much more of a value after the purchase, after the sale. So the demand shifts right. What does that do to our equilibrium price and quantity? Well, price is up and quantity is up. So anytime the demand changes, whatever direction the demand changes, here at the demand curve, the demand increases, so the demand curve shifts to the right. When demand increases, price and quantity move in the same way. Price increases, quantity increases. If the demand decreases, you actually see price and quantity both decrease. So anytime you have just a change in demand, the price and quantity are going to move in the same direction here, right? This demand curve no longer exists. The price of gas changed. This is now our demand curve. Price has gone up, price 2 versus price 1. Quantity's gone up, quantity 2 versus quantity 1. This is what we would expect with a shift in demand. So when demand increases, the curve shifts to the right. Equilibrium quantity increases, equilibrium price also increases. When demand decreases, we see the opposite. The demand curve shifts over to the left. Quantity is going to be cut back. Price is also lower. Okay, what happens to the supply curve when demand increases? Well, absolutely nothing. Right? In this past example, what happened to the supply? Nothing happened to the supply for hybrid cars. This is a thing that throws a lot of people off. a lot of you might look and say, wait a second, the supply went up, right? You went from one point to another. But remember, we need to remember the difference between a shift in supply and a movement along the supply curve. Our curve didn't change for supply. Supply curve is still exactly the same. So because of that, we say the supply didn't change, but the quantity supplied changed. Within this supply curve, we're at a different price, so there is a different level that's supplied. That is a movement along the supply curve, not a shift in the supply curve. So a shift in the demand curve caused a movement along the supply curve. Let's move over and look at what happens when the supply curve changes now. So a shift in supply instead of a shift in demand. We're going to look at hybrid cars again. New technology reduces the cost of producing hybrid cars. Okay? What is that going to mean for our demand? Nothing, right? Nothing about consumer preferences changes when a new technology reduces the cost. What about the supply? Well, step one, we know it's the supply curve shifting. Demand curve's not going to shift. Step two, how is this going to be? Will the supply increase, which is a shift to the right, or decrease, shift to the left? I hope that you kind of intuitively thought it's going to shift to the right. Right? For any given price, given that the cost is cheaper, for any given price, firms can now provide more. Right? So at this P1, firms should be able to provide more, and the supply curve should be out here. At any other price, supply curve should be higher. We should expect the supply curve to shift to the right. A new supply curve will be drawn in right about there. So production's more profitable at any given price. Firms can provide more. Well, what does that do to our equilibrium? Well, the price drops, but the quantity increases. So the increase in supply, the product is less scarce, quantity goes up. Because it's less scarce, there's some downward pressure on the price as well. And the price drops. So with the supply curve, if you have the supply curve shift, now quantity and price don't move together anymore. So supply increases, quantity will increase, but price will drop. If supply decreases, price will increase, but the quantity would drop, right? If you have some event that shifts the supply curve over to the left, which is a decrease in supply, say you might be right at like this point here, price goes up, quantity drops. So what happens when supply increases? Well, by definition, if supply increases, the supply curve shifts to the right. Our equilibrium quantity is going to increase, our price drops. When supply decreases, supply curve shifts to the left, the quantity decreases, but the price increases. So what happens to the demand curve when supply increases? This is a similar question we just asked about the supply. Once again, the answer now is it is still nothing. Right, let's go back to this graph. What happens to the demand curve when the supply increases? The demand curve stays right where it was. Nothing happens to the demand curve. What we do say, however, is that we have a movement along the demand curve. Right? We have a change in quantity demanded, which is caused by the movement along the demand curve. So here's a little summary. You have these all in your notes already. If you want kind of another spot where you have all four summarized at once, you can feel free to pause and jot down the summary of the supply and demand changes. So what happens if a supply and demand shift happens simultaneously? On your own, why don't you try to graph both of the effects that we just saw with the hybrid cars before we go through these together. So we will have the price of gas going up, which increases the demand, and the cost dropping, which increases the supply. So what I'd like you to try to figure out is what happens to the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity when demand increases and supply increases simultaneously. So a shift in both demand and supply. I hope you're took a shot at trying this on your own. You paused this and did that on your own. So what happens? Well, both curves shift, and both curves shift to the right. So we see an increase in both demand and supply. On your own, you should have found a new price and a new quantity. My guess is, well, if you did this correctly, you definitely found an increase in quantity. But the change in price could have been an increase, a decrease, or about the same. Right? The quantity rises, but the effect on the price is ambiguous. If demand increases more than supply, price rises. See, look at this example here. Demand increased more than supply. Price went up. But if supply increases more than demand, the price falls. So if you were given a question, like if you had just the question, what happens to equilibrium price and quantity if demand and supply increase at the same time? The correct answer, unless you're given more information, the correct answer would be the quantity will increase, but we don't know the change in price without more information. Or as they say, the change in price would be ambiguous. Whoops, let's get back to that last slide. So I say here, don't try to memorize this, right? You know, there could be a time on an exam where you're given a question, what happens if there's some change in the demand and or supply? And I guess if you had this memorized, that could help, but it's much better for it'll be much better. You'll know you get it right more if you can look at the demand and supply curve, and when we say, well, what about an increase in supply and no change in demand? And you don't need to do this. You just plot the demand and supply curve, and you know, oh, okay, I'll shift the supply curve to the right because it's an increase in supply, and then you find your answer. You don't need to know this. You could just do it, and then you get it right every single time. You don't have to rely on your memory for this. Further, you do need to, there'll be times when we have shifts in demand and supply later. You'll just want to know kind of how to do this. Sometimes you will hear economics professors, and me included on this one, say this is not a course to try to memorize things. It doesn't help. You need to learn the process of how to do things, and that will be, your life will be much simpler if that's how you spend your time than trying to memorize things. I do not recommend trying to do flashcards to learn economics. It just doesn't work very well. I mean, there's a few concepts, but it's much stronger if you just go through these various problems, think through these various situations, learn the process for how to solve these economic concepts.